Good evening. Right, sorry. We are experiencing once again some incredible technical difficulties here. New computers all gone tits up. The internet went tits up earlier, and so we are back on old school, the old laptop, and we're streaming through my mobile phone. So fingers crossed, it's all gonna stay on target. So yeah, the resolution might not be great. Apologies for that, but figured it would be better to stay trying to do it than not. So I just get it so I can see the chat. No, I haven't lost the bottle opener. Okay, so it might be a bit shorter than some of the other streams, but we will endeavour to talk a little bit about Spruce this evening, and also look at a couple of videos of kind of did like some basic sort of design principles and ideas about how to prepare trees for future work. So just sort of setting things up now, and just kind of like that holding back from rushing in and starting too quickly. So we'll look at that through some spruce material that we have, but just to really just kind of look at spruce in general, because they're one of those trees which people either have really great success with or are very, very difficult for a lot of people, and it'd be very difficult for me. I will admit that, so I might not be the best person to sort of really talk about spruce, although I do have a couple here. Just try and rearrange them so they're kind of like framing my... Let's get rid of that one. Let's have this one here. Yeah, I do have a couple here which have been doing okay this last year, but previously I've had pretty terrible success with spruce, particularly in my previous garden. And one of the reasons for that is that spruce are one of those species that really do like a certain type of environment, certain climate, and they are susceptible to sort of like a really quick drop in ill health if they don't have the right environment. And so I mentioned before that sort of talking about spruce, that the best place to have them is Willowbog Nursery up in the northeast of England. One of the reasons for this is that he's surrounded by forests of Sitka spruce, and Sitka spruce is not a native spruce to the UK. None of them are. They're all sort of imported, and so the sort of the forestry plantations of Sitka spruce, both there and over in Ireland, there's quite a lot of them over there. And those trees are possible to use for bonsai, but one of the reasons why they were chosen for forestry species is because they thrive in that sort of environment, which is very, very lots of fresh air, and there's quite a lot of moisture, and so there's quite a heavy sort of rainfall, and it also gets quite cold during the winter. And so if you don't have those sort of climatic conditions, then you find it very difficult to deal with spruce. So whenever I took trees from up there and brought them down to London, within a couple of years they would be struggling. So I'd put it down to the environmental factors, and I don't really know of anybody else who's had great success in urban environments, particularly the further down south you go. But then you look at people who live in that kind of like native type of environment, like even Norway, for example, and a lot of the Scandinavian countries, and particularly the Norway spruce or the European spruce, Pisceabies, grow very, very well there. So it's really quite a question of the sort of the climate, definitely I found for the Norway spruce. In terms of the Ezo spruce, which is the imported Japanese variety, technically, it's a banned species, and so they're not allowed to be imported. Sorry. So any of that obviously have been that you see around here have all been grown from cutting. And so what you tend to see with those is that most of the ones that have been imported in tend to be the Yatsubusa variety, and we'll look at some of those, some trees of those, and they are it's like a miniaturized version. So it's one of those sort of witch's broom type sports that has a certain type of growth habit. And most of them have been, all of them have been cultivated from cutting, essentially. It is possible to airlay them and things like that, but most of them have been sort of grown from cutting, and so they are much more suited to bonsai. And as a result, they, it's much more possible to do them in environments that aren't quite so conducive to that we were sort of different environments, a bit more urban environments. The Yatsubusa varieties are a lot easier to grow. I know a few people who have had great success with them. John Pitt, for example, he has had one for a number of years, and that's a very well known tree. It's on rock. I did have some pictures prepared, but they were on the other computer, so sorry about that. And he's had some issues with that over the years, and we'll sort of talk about a few of those. But it does, with the correct care, it does thrive. Another customer of mine has a similar Yatsubusa as a Spruce, and it's doing great. So that's one of the few varieties that you sort of can do in other sort of environments. In my experience, if anybody else out there has had better experience with them, then please let me know. We mentioned just very briefly about the Sitka spruce. They do tend to be a little bit more robust and sort of a little bit more vigorous than some of the other ones. Although the Norwegian spruce, in its right environment, is a very, very sort of strong tree. This is obviously a Norwegian spruce, and this was actually from Norway. And it was brought here last year, just as kind of like an experiment to see how well they would grow. And so obviously with any type of collected tree, there's that sort of genetic variance that goes across the species and stuff like that. And so far so good with this tree. It's been growing very, very well for me. Fingers crossed. It's the first time I have tried to grow a spruce where I am now. But we shall see. We are sort of seeing some dieback on the inner, and a little bit of discoloration in some of the older needles, but we'll just have to sort of persevere with that and see how it goes. But the Sitka spruce, I do know of several people. Ian Young in particular has had great success with those, and they've been doing very well. But his environment, as I said, is very sort of similar to as I was describing before. Quite wet, cold, and windy. So that's one of the things that helps. So those are the three kind of like main species that you would sort of tend to see in Europe, in the sort of our environment in the UK for certain. And then alongside that are a lot of kind of cultivars that are used for gardening. So a lot of sort of miniature varieties. There's all sorts of different ones that sort of come across. They all tend to be very sort of conical and have a real sort of dense, super dense kind of growth habit. So when I'm sort of talking about the Yatsubusa Ezo spruce, these other sports that these witches' brooms, these one branch that have those genetic variances, they get sort of taken, cultivated, and grafted on, and such like to be used for horticultural purposes. So for putting in the gardens and such like. So there are a lot of those that do get used for bonsai, and there is a certain amount of there are some of those varieties which I don't tend to use them too much, don't tend to come across them so much. But I've had a couple of questions that we'll cover over in the Q&A on Friday. People do tend to use them, and a lot of the difficulties that they have are because of that kind of sort of very dense, sort of excessive budding nature. And we will look at a little bit of that on the videos with the Yatsubusa variety. But yeah, spruce are a very kind of interesting tree to work with from bonsai because of their similar to larch, because of their very sort of strong sort of apical dominance, the importance of those sort of auxin producing sites, so the apex of the tree and also the ends of the branches, and so that sort of growth habit, sort of native sort of growth habit, really does tend to lend it to sort of certain styles, which are perhaps a little bit different from the sorts that you would sort of see with pines and junipers and things like that. And so you tend to want to sort of style them in a little bit more kind of natural looking ways. Not to say that those pines and the junipers don't tend to be, but they sort of try to move away from the sort of traditional looking bonsai images into looking to try to make some a little bit more kind of representations of some of the like the native or the natural environment trees. So one of the things that I've always I'd never really kind of been massively into spruce until when I was as an apprentice in Japan, because obviously living in Tokyo, they weren't species that I had too much to deal with, for the same reasons as we were mentioning with the Norway spruce and things like that in the UK. The Ezo spruce, which Ezo is an old word for Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island, and that's where most of those spruce come from. Obviously, that's a very sort of cold environment, a lot of snow in the winter, which is very important for spruce in order to keep them well protected. We'll talk about that in a minute. But obviously, where that sort of high, cold environment, the fresh air and the wetness isn't recreated in a city of concrete in Tokyo, and so we only had one tree and that suffered, and we just was basically just watching it die a slow death because it was just too hot in Tokyo. And so it wasn't a species that I had too much sort of contact with. And whenever I saw them at exhibitions, they were kind of interesting because within that Japanese aesthetic sort of framework, they were one of those trees which were naturally just quite a little bit sort of shaggy and untidy around the edges. And so when you saw all these sort of very perfect, lost it. Did we lose the stream there a little bit, I think? Sorry, I think we lost the stream there, Touch. Sorry, I was getting some red lights and it was saying that we'd lost the stream. So just a blip. Okay. Oh, that's all right then. So yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, that sort of shaggy around the edges aesthetic. And so when you sort of seeing like go to the Kokufu, which would generally be one of the few times I saw Ozo spruce in Japan, then it was always that kind of like nice little touch of naturalness in between the really sort of manicured junipers and pines and such like. So you come across this Ezo spruce, which is just a little bit untidy around the edges because it is very, very difficult to make the spruce foliage pads in the same way. But there was always that, just with the way that a lot of them had been styled, other than some of the forest plantings that you tended to see, particularly of Saburo Kato, who was very famous for dealing with Ezo spruce, and he went up and worked on them, collected them, and sort of worked with them a lot. Apart from those sort of forest-like images, you didn't sort of see too many that kind of like represented the types of images that you would see of the sort of the tall, straight spruce growing naturally. And it wasn't really until seeing a lot of the work that was done over in America with the American spruces. Some of the varieties that they have over there are just phenomenal. In particular, the stuff that Ryan Neal's been doing. It really kind of made me reevaluate spruce and think about them. So a few people have asked some questions about American spruces and things like that. I'm not really I'll look into it, but I'm not really the person to be asking, because my experience with American spruce, I've wired maybe about 3 or 4 trees in my entire time, and I've seen a lot, but that's about it. So I'm not really the person to ask. But but yeah, where I was going with that. So like from the aesthetic perspective, it was always a tree that I liked, but I'd never really had great success with. So we do like I'm sort of trying to persevere with it, but yeah, it's one of those things that might be out of my reach for some time. Okay, so one of the reasons that a lot of people do have issues with spruce is the way in which they approach the kind of the pinching of them, and the sort of the working on the foliage, and also from a lot of the sort of the pests and diseases that can come quite quickly from a tree being weak, either from sort of poor environment or from messing around with the roots. The only like every time I've had like sort of either my trees or catastrophic or customers' trees, like had that sort of catastrophic incidents, has always come soon after repotting. And so one of the things we found with spruce is that try not to mess around with the roots too much. I was having a discussion with some of the willow bog regulars on Monday. We were talking about spruce, and because one of the trees that I had went back there and it's gone to somebody else, and he's had some problems with it. And we were discussing the roots and how a lot of the trees that are successful up at Willow Bog Nursery, the roots on them are incredibly compact. Had tried to get to talk to Peter a little bit about spruce, but technologically it was somewhat difficult because of the internet connection up there. But I'll speak to him at some point about it. Maybe get him on. But so his approach to repotting is to not really do very much, and that seems to work very, very well. Once they've kind of established themselves in a pot, then it's just try to sort of keep them there as much as possible. And from speaking to other people, that does seem to be one of the sort of the keys to success. So messing around with the roots too much once they've established is doing. Oh yeah. So Rowena has just said, yeah, her spruce, or Dan, that we worked on is doing well. That's because you live up in the north. There are benefits to living up there. But yeah, so messing around with the roots too much is one of those things that I think spruce tend to disagree with. However, that said, one of the species that is possible to send to America is the Ezo spruce. So importing into Europe spruce are banned, but for normal bonsai, it's possible to do it with the soil on just as it is. The tree as it is in Japan. It has to go through some quarantine procedures and inspections and such like that. And there are a list of banned species, but essentially they come sort of as is. Whereas exporting to America, everything has to be bare rooted, so all of the soil gets taken off of the roots. Ezo spruce is one of those species that is possible to do that, and having had this experience of every time a spruce dying had been to sort of these catastrophic events with spruce, had always been sort of to do with the roots. I was very, very sort of reluctant to kind of to work with a customer of mine who buys and imports trees into the United States. I was very reluctant to sort of to push very expensive spruce on them, because I just had this idea that they were just going to sort of collapse and die. However, even though they were bare rooted, the process of the quarantine in the United States. Basically, they get put in a quarantine house and misted all the time because of the bare rooting process. And surprisingly, all of these Ezo spruce managed to survive because of that constant mist. And so what that sort of tells you is that the humidity around, the humidity in the air, the humidity around the spruce is very, very important. Whenever we work on them with wiring, for example, it's always, always, always absolutely essential to keep misting the foliage, and to keep it very moist. And so after repotting, for example, trying to put them in sort of a humidity tent, keeping them in greenhouses, keeping them out of the wind is very, very, very sort of key. And so although we said having that clear air, clean air, and the wind sort of going through them, drying winds, for example, need to be avoided wherever possible, particularly in times of stress. So after repotting, for example, keeping the humidity up is key, and also that does help to alleviate one of the big problems that sort of having that high humidity and misting the foliage, keeping moisture on the foliage, does tend to help with one of the problems that we have, which is spruce mite. And so that's really one of the biggest issues that we've had, that I've seen, in terms of sort of insects attacking them. I don't know if anybody else has had any issues, but really it's just the spider mite damage and spruce mite damage has been the only things that have sort of been sort of fatal from an insect perspective in the UK. And that obviously having sort of misting, similar with junipers, the mites don't like that humidity. They don't like the moisture being sort of blasted on the foliage a lot, and so keeping them moist is one way of sort of trying to prevent that. One of the symptoms of spider mite, spruce mite damage is the inner foliage starting to, so all of the older foliage and the inner foliage where it's sheltered starts to turn yellow. The colour starts to go out of it, and it starts to just kind of lose some of its vigour. And so if you start to see that sort of beginning to happen with your spruce, then just sort of tend to just take a piece of paper, rub the foliage and have a look for any sort of critters sort of running around. That's basically the kind of the only issue that I've seen, and then the solution to that is some type of contact insecticide would be the best thing, and then sort of lime sulfuring them over the winter with a sort of a watered down solution, about 30 parts water to 1 part lime sulfur. That would definitely help to sort of get rid of them. But keeping the foliage moist does, as I say, sort of tend to prevent that. So those people who live in that sort of natural moist sort of environment would just say, well, why would you bother? But for those of us who don't, that's one of the keys to sort of success with spruce. I've found. Other than that, it's about keeping them. As I said, the moisture level in the pot as well is something which is key. I would look at that with the 3 trees that got the kind of the video on, and the styling issues on. This tree has just sort of been sort of fairly freshly collected a couple 3 years ago, and the root system on it is very good, but that's almost 50% sphagnum moss in there. This is very wet at the moment, but sort of if it dries out a little bit, you can see just how much sort of sphagnum moss is in there, and so that's really kind of like helping to sort of keep them to keep it really moist. And keep the tree growing there. So obviously, that when this tree comes for its first repot, it's going to be next year, I feel. Then it'll have to go into a humidity tent. It's going to have to go into a soil mixture, which is going to be quite moisture retentive, and it's going to be able to sort of supply the amount of moisture that the tree needs. So obviously, with the needles on it, quite a high surface area. There's a lot of and particularly once we start to allow them to extend out, there's quite a lot of moisture lost through the foliage. So obviously you have to have that reservoir there, the soil mixture, the root system there to be able to support that. So the soil mixture obviously would be somewhat moisture retentive, and I would also look at putting just a small amount of kind of like organic material in there, because again, mycorrhizal development is essential for spruce as well as anything else. So maybe just that sort of keeping a little bit of sphagnum moss in there. Sorry, a couple of questions came in. Dave Reynolds, what is the other 50%? Pumice. So it's about 50% sphagnum, 50% pumice. I didn't pot it up first time. Somebody else did. So, yes. What else? That's probably about it really in terms of spruce kind of cultivation tips. I'll just answer this question then. Right, okay. Question: with a recently repotted spruce, would a top dressing of sphagnum moss be good? Yes, that would be a good idea. To definitely to sort of try and maintain the humidity levels, the moisture levels, particularly in that top level of soil there. So that's pretty much kind of like it, I think, in terms of, in terms of fertilizing them, just sort of a normal amount of fertilizer. Is, they're not massively hungry trees, they should be starved, because, sorry, that was my phone, I hope that doesn't cause the stream to stop. Yeah, so just sort of a normal amount of fertilizer. They're not supremely hungry, and they shouldn't be starved in order to kind of reduce needle length and such like that. It's a pretty sort of consistent needle length. Any sort of variations will be sort of genetic, or for those sort of different varieties and things like that. So really, the key thing is the management of these tips. Okay, and as we sort of looked at with the larch, as we're going to look at with the taxus on Sunday, that's what's coming up. We definitely will be on course for a proper stream then. Then it's very important to allow them to extend out in a controlled and balanced way. But extension is key for success with spruce, because is this light green foliage that we see here that is really kind of like driving the tree forward, photosynthesizing in a very efficient way, and enabling the tree to cool down in the summer. So yes, a lot of spruce sort of do like those sort of cold environments, but in the summer it does get hot. Norwegian summers, Scandinavian summers can get incredibly hot, and these trees need to be able to cope with that. And so it's that soft new foliage which is photosynthesizing, which is transpiring, which is taking the moisture up from the roots through the tree, absorbing the heat, taking it out through there, which is very important. So going in and pinch all the time can lead to some serious issues of just a lack of vigor in general, but also damage in the summer. And so definitely letting them extend out and having a decent amount of good foliage on there. Obviously, some of the strong areas you might need to just look at stopping them from overpowering the weaker areas, because obviously allowing them just to grow out unchecked, which is what's happened to a couple of other trees, the strong areas get really strong, the weaker areas on the inside start to die off, and so from a stylistic perspective, then we have some issues. So we've got to look at the kind of like the balancing of the horticultural needs of the tree, the biological needs of the tree, in terms of the photosynthesis and the cooling, as well as our aesthetic demands on the tree. And so it's not to say just don't pinch at all, and it's not to say pinch everything. Okay, so you just got to figure out how to really look at sort of controlling the growth, so you're getting nice even growth over the whole tree. That's going to be discussed in the video, so it's probably a good idea to kind of like go into that, and then we can look at some of those points and sort of discuss them as we're going. So basically this is explained a little bit in the video, but it's not styling the tree like tremendously at the moment, because it's not a great time to be going in and wiring the wiring spruce too much, one of the best times to sort of do that is towards the end of the year. So October, November is really a good time to sort of get in there and get amongst the foliage and things like that. But there was a number of trees that I've been asked to work on, and they basically just been left alone for a number of years, and they need that initial kind of push in the right direction. And so when we're sort of approaching material like that, it's about having a, in a sense, similar to the stream I did about the the creative process with the beach, that having that sort of mental flexibility to kind of go along with what's going to happen with the tree, what the tree sort of throws up. So it's having a vague idea of where, or more than vague idea of where you want to go. Okay, so I'm going to push it towards this this ultimate goal, but equally just being having the idea that things may go wrong because with weakened trees, branches may die. There might be issues with the roots and things like that, or in this case of putting multiple trees together, when you actually sort of get into the roots, it might not sort of come together. So how we sort of went about these trees is to kind of go 90% of the way of where we were kind of like wanting to go in terms of like branch removal and things like that. So some of the sort of the considerations for the styling were both from a health perspective, so both thinking about keeping as much of that good foliage on there as possible, but also giving ourselves a couple of different kind of like insurance backup plans just in case things went wrong. So we'll have a look at that. I'll answer some of the questions, and if anybody does have any sort of specific questions, then please do come in and ask. Here we have 3 spruce. They are customers' trees, and I've just been asked recently to look at them and to sort of prepare them for making a multiple tree planting next year. It's a bit too late to do that now. The buds have already started to open, so we can see that lovely light extension there. So this is a Yatsubusa type of Azo spruce, and we can see that lovely extension sort of coming out there. Very, very strong and dense up in the top, not so strong and dense down at the bottom. So these trees have basically been left to their own devices for a number of years, ostensibly to give them strength, but what's starting to happen is a really poor kind of like balance between top and bottom. So we can see the length, the number, just the general vigour of those buds down there compared as we go up the tree to the density, the vigour, the colour of those buds up at the top, and also inside to out. So very little activity going on inside, lots going on the outside. Now this is very typical of spruce because they are very, very, like larch and like a lot of trees, beech, very, very kind of apically dominant. So that's the apical dominance of both the top of the tree and also the ends of the branches. And so left to their own devices, this is basically what happens. Lots of activity at the end, not so much going on the inside. Lots of activity at the top, not so much down below. So what we'll look at doing is cleaning these trees up, balancing them, and look at the design for the future. So the first job I'm going to do is just go in and cut off anything that's dead or dying. Just clean it up, just very quickly. It'll take maybe 5 to 10 minutes over the whole tree. Just go in, anything that's really weak, even if there's a little bit of foliage on it, we'll just get in there and clean them out. This lower branch here is not going to be used. We can get rid of that one straight away. We know that that's not going to be used. This weaker one here, that one as well. And just go through, cleaning out dead bits, weak bits. What this does is it gives me the opportunity to get to know the tree a little bit more, to look at the branching structure. So I'm not just going through and just brainlessly cleaning, but what I'm actually doing is looking at the branching structure. I'm noticing all the different features. There's a very interesting kind of like V section here. I'm considering the thickness of the branches. I'm looking at movement in the trunk. All of these things as I'm sort of cleaning. It gives me that just little bit of time to say, how are you doing, mate? What's the crack? What should we do today, sort of thing. And so it's not just a brainless exercise. So what do we mean by weak branches? It's stuff like this. Stuff where there's no tips that have opened up by now. This has been coated in the residue from hard water, and so no buds opened up yet. That's basically just waiting to die. So stuff like that needs to be removed. And then even some of these branches which have the foliage on there, if they're coming in from the same point, spruce have a tendency to send out 2 or 3 branches from the same node. Then we'll just look at getting rid of any obvious ones where it's becoming a little bit too clustered. So just having spent 5 to 10 minutes on that, cleaning it up and getting rid of some of those lower branches, it now starts to look a little bit more like a bonsai rather than just a giant bush. So we'll do the same thing to the other 2 trees, and then we'll look at the combination of them all together. So this one has a lot of weak lower branches coming from in there, so we'll just look at removing those. This is one of those situations where of multiple branches coming from one node. And this very, very low branch as well. That will all come out, just to give us a clearer line of the trunk. If we're doing a multiple tree plantation, then we're not really going to want to have too much lower foliage, lower branches down there. Anything that's of a decent thickness we will keep just to begin with, particularly this branch here. But other than that, a lot of this lower stuff can come out just because of the weakness and of the styling that we're going to go. Okay, so that's the second one cleaned out. Again, it's starting to look a little bit more like a bonsai, especially because we cleared off those lower branches, which is the majority of the stuff that you can see down there. Okay, so now onto the third and a lot weaker tree. So we do actually have 2 options for the third tree, and we're going to just clean both of them up and then look at the combinations of them all. They're both sort of very similar in size and sort of trunk thickness. This one's ever so slightly bigger than that one, but realistically, I think having a 4-tree composition is going to be a little bit strange. We'll look at that once we get together, but we'll prepare them both in the same way, cleaning them both up. So with a lot of this inner growth, we have some adventitious bud formation that is starting to grow really nicely and healthily and happily. But if it isn't starting to grow by now, then we'll just get rid of all of this stuff in here. Something like that has definitely got no chance of sending out any type of adventitious buds in there. These branches are fairly young, so there is still a possibility of developing some in there, but realistically there's no point waiting on this to wake up and grow. So we'll just get rid of that and look at utilising these buds and this growth on the inside, which is happening in a few places. So both of those are now cleaned up, and one interesting thing has come to my attention, and that is this very interesting twin trunk affair going on in this tree. So that's something we could look to utilise for certain. This tree here is a bit sparse, but has some interesting movement and branches up in the top. So that kind of comes up and then just kicks off to the side, very sort of spruce-like. And those sort of lovely spruce-like straight branches. And so this is really exhibiting that kind of very natural growth habit of a really sort of upright single spruce. And so there's a good possibility that we would want to make that just as an individual tree rather than as a group. So the next thing to do is just to have a look around at the base of each of the trunks, just figure out with any sort of issues with the nabari. Obviously they've not been planted properly because they're a little bit wobbly in the pot. Some are obviously in pond baskets in order to develop the roots. It's in a soil mixture which contains quite a lot of essentially cat litter, which isn't something that I particularly like using for various different reasons. So we'll just have a look at the root structure, just expose some of those surface roots, and then that will give us more of an idea of what's possible from a styling perspective. So now we've exposed the roots, we'll have a look at them individually. So the twin apex one in the pond basket has very nice kind of side root here, clasping into the ground, and so this kind of slanting planting angle is a definite kind of like possibility with that root holding it securely in the ground. This has nothing massive to speak of. There's one quite big powerful surface root, there's another little one going across there, but it goes down and doesn't particularly flare out to anything, so nothing great one way or the other with that one. No problems, no positives. With the sort of the medium trunk one, we have one thick heavy root across on this side, a lot of sort of quite fine a lot of fine roots here, but nothing too thick. One way to check that is to dig in and just try and see if you come across anything woody. There isn't anything particular except across there. So this section we have some quite woody roots. Everywhere else there isn't anything of note. There isn't anything of note. With the bigger tree, there are a lot of impressive sort of surface roots across here and there. This is a very young and vigorous root coming out from there. There you can sort of see just how youthful that one looks compared to some of the other ones. Okay, and it's quite hard to get that chopstick in. Okay, a lot of compacted soil. Okay, so clearly this one's got much more of a nice all-round nabari, a few sort of strong roots. So we're starting to get an idea of what we have to play with. Okay, so that was the initial kind of getting to know the trees and trying to figure out kind of some arrangements of them. Now, just with one tree by itself, when you're kind of bringing a tree back from ill health or sort of trying to figure out that sort of initial styling, it's difficult enough just to kind of like make those decisions. But then sort of putting multiple ones together, obviously the last section there about the roots, there's going to be a certain amount of flexibility sort of required in order to sort of give you that opportunity, that sort of making it, in case we end up with issues with the roots and things like that. So just giving yourself a few more options there is one of sort of like the key ideas of the styling of those. In terms of the foliage sort of management and trying to keep as much on there. Somebody mentioned, so Tom said, any limits on how much green you can remove at once? And Steve Dutchy said about sort of pinching back. I'll sort of look at the sort of the foliage management a little bit in the next section. But realistically, what we're looking at is allowing some growth in this situation. Okay, so trying to get it up and healthy. Then once it's healthy, once it's going really, really sort of strongly, then spruce will respond very well to being pruned back hard. Okay, but until they're established, then it's important to sort of let them grow. Particularly when the branches are weak. Okay, so a lot of the branches that we saw there, the cleaning out process, and a lot of the ones that were removed, these were weakened branches, and it's very difficult for them to sort of strengthen themselves up. Once you start getting that new growth to start sort of coming through from the inside, and you start getting those sort of youthful, vigorous branches, then certain varieties, particularly Sitka spruce, will respond very, very well to being cut back hard. And so the whole point of what we're sort of trying to do in terms of leaving a lot of the stuff on there on the trees is going to be to sort of build up that strength. So yeah, the flexibility is an important thing, and you'll see a little bit about that as we go through and look at the individual trees now. So looking at a multiple trunk planting, what we need to do is consider the thickness of the trunks, and this one is ever so slightly thicker than this one. So we'll clearly go with this one as our kind of like our main tree, and then build around that. So what we'll do first is look at the branches and the styling of this as a main tree, with this one as a close companion. So we'll look at the orientation of the potential orientations of those two. So what we're going to do is look at an orientation sort of similar to this. One of the reasons for that is that we have very few branches on this side of the trunk, very few branches on this side. We've also got this fibrous root system here rather than any big, thick, heavy roots. And so when it comes to repotting time, this is going to be a lot easier to sort of separate that and bend those around. Similarly, that big, strong, heavy root, or the vigorous root, is sort of going out towards the back there. We do have one strong root which comes out to about this part, about to here, but we should be able to manipulate that. And so we can get rid of this soil and bring those two trunks a little bit closer together. So what we need to look at doing is removing some of these lower branches that are going to interfere with each other, so we have that sort of space in between those two trees. So we'll get rid of this one here. We'll get rid of that one there. Maybe just leave a little stump. And then what we need to do is come up and look at this separation in here. So this orientation that we see there, the split in the trunk up in the top there is slightly visible. What's going to happen is that the highest point, the highest apex, is going to be vertical and stay essentially where it is. And then where this splits, we're going to take that off and round towards the back. Give us a little bit of depth, and that's going to sort of sit in the space between the two main sort of apices of the two individual trees. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. So we'll look at removing some of these. So here is that split halfway up the trunk. And then we'll just bend that one out and towards the back there. So we'll just work at deciding on which branches are going to be assisting or hindering us in that. So the branches, the trunks are still very flexible. So we'll try and separate it around about here to kind of get a rough estimate of the length. And then we'll cut that. So that's separated it out a little bit. But if you notice, it's not going to take much for that to pop out. So what we'll do is we'll just create a rounded section in here and there that will sit nicely on the trunks. So you can see it's ever so slightly angled. We've got that indentation in there. That's just going to sit on the trunk and it won't slip off one way or the other. Similar on the other side as well. Okay, so that's in there nice and tight and secure. How long that'll need to be there for, who knows. A good few years, I would imagine. So with that in mind, now we can start looking at some of the removal of the other branches. What we're going to want to do at the appropriate time will be to wire some of those branches down to sort of form the apex in and around there. So we'll be looking at keeping a lot of those branches on this side, opening out. Maybe giving it a little bit of space between the two here. So the apex of the main tree will be a little bit more on this side. Up in the top here, it's just a cluster of branches, of twigs, all sort of coming out from one point. So I'm going to need to thin that down somewhat. Not all the way down to just 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, because then we'll have nothing on the tree. And there'll be no new growth to photosynthesize and to generate energy for the roots and for other buds. But we do need to sort of start to bring some sort of type of structure into that. So one of the things we're going to look to do with the branches is to make them very sort of spruce-like. And so what does that mean? It means for these lower branches, sort of down, straight, no movement in them, straight and relatively pointy. So we'll be looking at lowering these branches until we start to get up into the top of the tree, where we'll start to see them growing upwards a little bit to give us a sense of maturity in there. Okay. A very young tree would be triangular. A more mature tree would have the longer flowing branches coming out, and in the top of the tree a little bit more upward movement and a big, slightly more flattened crown. So we'll definitely look at keeping the length on these branches here. One thing we do just have to think about is the use of these lower branches from a styling perspective. Do we need to use them or not? I think we'll leave that decision with this branch until it comes to repot and the actual sort of the styling decision. Same thing with this one. I think this one will definitely get used potentially to go out the back. But this lowest branch here, I can't foresee us wanting to use that. I want to try and remove the lower branches out on the bigger tree to give it a sense of elegance, to give it a sense of height. But there is potential for using one of these two. So we're going to keep those just for the time being. Now that they've had a lot of the branches around them removed, then a little bit more sunlight will get to them, a little bit more airflow will get to them. And what we won't do too much of is pruning the tips on any of these. We'll just let it strengthen up a little, and then look at pruning back later on in the year. But what we will do is look at pruning back some of the top areas, some of these stronger shoots, in order to get a little bit more growth from the inside. So we need to look at the branch, and then look at taking out the strongest terminal buds. Either just pinching it out like that to leave the two side shoots, okay, or having a look on the underside and then following the branch along, see where it comes off and splits up into two. So here, for example, we could either cut back to there, where it splits into those two, or more realistically, we would want to come in, cut back to those two, which would then try and grow off and become the new leader. And then at the tips of those shoots, we can just take out the strongest one to leave the two side shoots there. So we're really looking at auxin producing sites and restricting their development. So the decision making process is looking at the vigor at the tip, the vigor on the inside, seeing how much we need to push back. Branch like this, for example, very weak. Not massively weak, but it's slightly weaker than some of the other ones coming from the inside, thinner than everything else. We won't touch that. This one here, just come, take a few of the terminal ones off, just to take that there. Look underneath, come in, cut back that. Just the terminal tip here, just the terminal tip there. So that will give us a bit more of a rounded, more mature looking foliage pad. It'll make the side shoots grow out. But I always have to keep in mind all the different factors that I'm trying to balance at the moment. Okay, so lower branches, perhaps won't prune them back anywhere near as much. Just comparing branches, similar length branches to each other. Okay, so this here is clearly a little bit longer than the branch division here and that branch. So we can come in, be a little bit more aggressive there. just to try and balance things up. Lower branches we don't touch. This branch we're going to want that one to be growing outwards, but we just want a bit more growth on the inside, so we can just nudge it back. Just nudge it back. Nudge it back. So we're not putting a massive brake on the forward progress. We're just removing that strongest auxin producing shoot, trying to push it back inside a little. So every now and often we just have to step back and look at how much green's been cut off, how much of this light green stuff is left on the tree. Don't really want to start going much further than that, because then there isn't going to be enough of those extending tips there to really photosynthesize. There isn't going to be enough of those green tips there to help cool the tree down in the summer if we're not careful, and also drive root production. So for the time being, we've got a sort of a good idea of what we're looking for there. We've created some space which we can then fit this tree into. We're keeping branches all around on the other side. We'll be looking at wiring some of those branches down in the future, and we looked at just sort of balancing up the growth, the energy from the top to the bottom, and then from the outside, just stopping some of those real strong areas to allow some of the inner growth to develop. So now what we'll do is we'll start looking at the other tree. So because of the main trunk, because of the space here, I'm going to look at pushing it up against that main trunk. Probably something kind of along those lines, with the line, the apex coming across towards the left hand side. Right, we'll get rid of that branch there, we don't want that one. Just looking at areas where there's two branches coming from the same position. Here, for example, 1, 2, 3, all doing the same thing. The weakest one at the bottom will go. Then we can keep both of the others, because what we can do is we can separate them one way or the other. Similarly with that branch there. This one coming from the base of the main branch in there. We'll take that one out there. There's a good chance we might want to take those off, but for the time being we'll keep them. And we'll just go through, thin out the apex again. So taking off shoots from the base of branches. Thinning out that clustering effect. Okay, so far that's about as much as we want to go. We've thinned it out similar to the previous one. We're starting to see a structure of it as a tree individually. We're keeping these longer branches here on the left hand side and some around the back, but we have very few on the right. Or potentially look at this one with the strong roots grasping into the soil and the two trunks separated there. I think this is going to be the interesting arrangement, and it all is going to depend on how we look at planting it. I can foresee there being slab rocks involved, some different heights perhaps, and so I think we'll work with those two as a pair, and then this one sort of slightly separated, but definitely part of that composition. So what we'll do is we'll look at it at this type of orientation, look at separating those two out and removing any of the real weak branches. Other than that, we'll look at keeping as much on there as possible until the final planting. So same thing here, we just separated the two across there. We're going to want this one to be fairly vertical, and this one to be the sort of the secondary trunk, and definitely look at extending out some of these branches across here. So that's just a start for this tree. This is a lot weaker than the other ones, and what we'll look at doing, what I'll just do now is I'll just drop it into a different pot. So we're going to keep it at that angle, and maybe just try and replace some of this cat litter with something a little bit more suitable for larch to grow into, not larch, spruce to grow into. Okay, so let's just put all three of them together and just have a look at what the possibilities may be.
Okay, so I know it's very amateurish and very sort of difficult to see, but I'm sure you can kind of imagine what we're trying to do there. So obviously we can start to play around when we come to plant it on a slab or a pot, and ultimately we want it to be about this big, not that much bigger, possibly longer if we're going to use a slab, but we're going to look at really sort of fitting those two together and then manipulating the branches around so that it accommodates that. And then if we could raise both of those up a little, perhaps have some rock feature in there as well, then we could have this one sort of sticking out the side, giving us some very nice sort of dynamic movement. But as I say, it's a bit difficult to try and like imagine it now. And this is where having kind of like the experience will help. And just sort of being able to envisage it. I can see it in my mind's eye, kind of like where I'm going with it. But what we've done is prepare the trees to grow and sort of start pushing them along in that direction. However, should that not work, then at least all of the trees will have the capability of being standalone bonsai, looking quite good. But initially, what we've done, we've figured out some of the sort of structures of the trees. We've looked at thinning out the tops, getting rid of those unnecessary lower branches, getting sunlight into and airflow into this, into the inner parts of the tree. Stopped it at the tips. We're going to see that growth coming from the inside, and so they're not just being left to grow unrestrictedly.
Okay, so obviously I sort of said in the video there it was a bit of a, it needs a little bit of imagination to sort of see where that's going, but there's an idea there, and those trees were worked in such a way that it was moving towards a sort of a definite idea, but doing what was sort of seasonally appropriate. And so it wouldn't really be seasonally appropriate to go in there and wire it as much as I would like to. And to start sort of pushing branches in all those different places. Not only would it not be sort of necessarily seasonally appropriate, but perhaps not appropriate for the potentials for the future. So obviously, when you're sort of going to think about putting things together in terms of that kind of like multi-trunk arrangement and potentially using some rocks, changing heights and things like that, then obviously having that sort of flexibility is a sort of a key thing. So one of the things I kind of wanted to, one of the reasons I wanted to do that is to sort of show that the styling of a tree or the creation of bonsai doesn't just happen in one kind of like sitting. It's a process over number of sittings, a number of workings, and it's about doing what's kind of like important at the time. What's important at this time particularly for spruce is that thinning out of the dense areas and ensuring that you've got the growth tips doing exactly what you want for whatever purpose it is. So in some situations, for example, for a much more refined tree, then you would be perhaps going around and pinching out a lot more kind of like evenly. So once you've kind of got that sort of foliage pad created, you'll be looking at trying to maintain the sort of the strength and the balance across the across the foliage pad. If you're looking at creating back budding, for example, there were some questions about sort of getting incredible amounts of back budding, then allowing things to extend out and then cutting back hard is a good way of achieving that. So sort of cutting back later on in the year. So doing the similar sort of things as we would be doing with, larch and the taxus that we'll look at next time. So that kind of like the tip management is the sort of the key thing to be thinking about at the moment. Ralph had asked a question here about spruce form buds very early on in the season. It seems there may be a window of 2 to 4 weeks to pinch new growth and still have sufficient buds formed on what's left. Any later, anything even close to harding just won't do in my experience. Can you comment? So are you talking about trying to get a second flush of growth, or just to buds for the following year? Because realistically, what I would be looking at doing is always kind of letting them grow out a little bit more, before pinching back, because as you say, there is a very sort of short window of opportunity. You pinch too soon, and the engine of the tree doesn't get running up too much. Let them get too far out, and then you're not going to get that second flush of growth. So really, it's about sort of just managing it, and particularly looking at managing it so that we've always got these. The adventitious buds sort of coming out, and going through that similar as we're sort of talking with the larch, and we'll definitely look at it with the taxus. But it's always about trying to get these to come out and replace, and there'll always be this kind of rebuilding of the branch tips was the word I was looking for, and of the foliage pads to a certain extent, and keeping them vigorous and able to do that is an important part of it. So allowing those extensions out helps it to keep it vigorous, helps to keep the energy flowing backwards and forwards, but then it's about maintaining the balance so that those inner buds, the weaker shoots on the inside, can be cut back to growing out again. Gets a little bit too big, then we come back to other growth on the inside. So that cyclical nature of the foliage pads is one of the key things. Once you kind of like get into the maintenance mode of pinch, then it's very kind of important to pinch in such a way that you're not then reliant on new buds forming. Okay, so if you're pinching at the tip, for example, you're pinching on the tip here, you're not reliant on buds forming in here. You've always got some stuff further back in to keep coming through. So you don't want to get into that sort of pinching stage until there's a lot of foliage coming from the inside in order to replace it, in case you don't get the bud formation. I think I'll try and maybe make a diagram or something to kind of explain that a bit, or it might come a little bit more apparent with the taxus, because that's a little bit more of a vigorous back budder and sort of coming through kind of idea. So what else do? We can just answer some of the questions that have come up, and I don't really have anything else to say about those videos. No. So one of the questions that was mentioned was about why don't I like cat litter. And that's so yes, Brian Kavanagh says, Peter, why don't you like using cat litter? A lot of people do use cat litter or molar as a soil, and have some success. But for me personally, it's one of those things that is used and designed to absorb oil spills. It's very absorbent, and so its job is to absorb a lot of things, and so it can absorb too much from the soil and hold on to too much moisture. If the soil then sort of tends to dry out a little bit, it can suck moisture from the roots and things like that, and it just always feels, for me, just very, very, very dry. And so I've never had great success with it. A lot of people, I've seen more people have poor success with it than others. For trees in development, for example, if you mix it with something like John Innes or some, a lot of kind of like, some sort of composty type thing, and a lot of organic material, then that sort of tends to help kind of like balance up the moisture retention, I feel, but yeah, it's just not something I tend to want to use in my soil mixtures. So that's kind of like why I don't want to use it. Right, Bonsai Egypt question: needle casting issue. I've not experienced it, so I can't really answer that one. Have you ever had problems with it? You're probably best. Right, when you say cut back hard new growth on a spruce, This is a question from Morton. Do you mean cutting off all new growth on a branch, Mercury style, or cutting back 1/3 or 2/3? So pinching, sort of pinching back the growth is where you would take the new growth and then shorten it an appropriate amount. So either 1/3 or two, leave 1/3 or 2/3, just to stop the extensions. And that is essentially just to balance up the extensions. So where you have got, so here in this case, we've got 2 shoots on the side, one long one in the middle one. We can either look at removing that one entirely or just trying to balance it up so there's going to be a similar length to the 2 beside it. Okay, so that's one way of looking at the pinching, just to kind of like balancing it up. When we're talking about sort of cutting back hard structurally and such like that, it's about going in and cutting back to secondary branches and things like that. Alternatively, later on in the year, and we will look at this, particularly with Taxus and Spruce again, coming in and cutting back just to old growth at a later point in the year, and then getting sort of the bud formation in there. But obviously the tree's got to be super healthy, really sort of strong. With Sitka spruce, then you could do that a lot more, because obviously with it being a really vigorous tree, how hard you can cut a tree back, be it a spruce, larch, Taxus, pine, or anything like that, it all depends on the amount of energy and just how vigorous it is, how strong the root system is, how vigorously it's grown throughout the year and stuff like that. So keeping them growing well, allowing the extensions, can allow you to be able to cut it back harder. It happens in Ireland. Okay, we'll look into it and try and figure out some possible solutions. But basically, needle cast is, so obviously the misting of your trees in order to keep the foliage moist and to reduce the amount of moisture loss from transpiration, so breathing through the needles, essentially moisture loss through the needles. Misting it is kind of essential for that, but it also, unfortunately, can cause a lot of needle cast issues. So how do you sort of combat the two? We'll look about that. I'll look into it, Ian. But basically it'll be fungicide at the appropriate time of year. So when that is, I don't know. So I've not had experience of it. So Mancozebs, yeah. I mean, basically any type of a needle cast is a couple of different fungicides is the thing, but it's about getting the timing right for when the spores are flying over. Is the key. Right, Paul, a question from Paul Pashley. Question: how would you go about reducing an overly large root system suitable into to fit into a bonsai pot? I've always basically had the best result by just doing it properly, doing it at once, building up enough strength into the trees. So we never really want to go in and repot sick trees. So as I said, the one that was in the kitty litter, we wouldn't want to go in and repot that at the moment, because A, it's the wrong time of year, the buds are already beginning to push out, and B, it's already in a weakened condition. So asking it then to do more work when it can't sustain itself is only asking for trouble. So really building up the vigor of the tree, pushing it, making sure it's got lots of growth. And then going in and just being super careful with the repot, and then giving it the right aftercare, so putting it in a humidity tent and things like this. I've never subscribed to this idea of reducing it by a little bit, letting it come over, reducing it by a little bit more. Doing it all in small stages. You're basically just extending that procedure out over a long time. Okay, just do it once, do it properly. And if it fails, it fails. But at least you're going to know it quite quickly. But the key to it is the aftercare. And so, as I sort of said before, the bare rooting the Ezo spruce from Japan to America, for example, is the most stressful thing you could possibly do to the trees. But as long as they get the correct aftercare, then the success rate is very, very high. And that successful aftercare is putting it into a soil medium that's going to be moisture retentive enough to be able to support the new roots coming through, but not so wet that the soil temperature drops down. So quite a high pumice mix, but there's some macadamia in there. But the overhead misting is key. So if you are going to do it like a big sort of severe repot, do it properly, get it down into a bonsai size pot, a suitable bonsai size pot, all in one go, but make sure you've got the aftercare ability afterwards. So creating a little humidity tent, having an overhead misting system, having a humidifier. You can buy them, a humidifier for £30-40, which is just going to put moisture up into the air. They're not too expensive, keeping it out of the wind and things like that. So you can do that. So, okay. In theory, could you do a small wedge cut into a bird's nest spruce and have it be okay? Do you mean to Kevin? Do you mean to bend a branch down? I don't know, to be honest. Whenever I've had to bend spruce branches and things like that, they've always just kind of, I've always been able to just bend them just without needing to put cuts and things into it. Okay, if there's any more questions, particularly, then just put them in an email or something, and just we'll sort of try to cover it. But basically, that's just kind of like a real. I'm not, as I said right at the start, I'm not the biggest kind of expert on spruce because I don't grow them particularly brilliantly. But a lot of the concepts about them are equally are very similar to larch, and to Taxus. I can't remember the damn thing. Taxus are going to be the one. Are going to be the tree that we're going to look at on Sunday. We've got a lot of examples of lots of different species, lots of different types of trees and different situations there. But really, it's very much about that. Making sure that you've got that good extensions, allowing the energy to be generated and to flow through the tree. But then also thinking about particularly the environmental considerations. That's one thing that sort of larch and Taxus particularly. Taxus are really kind of tolerant of a lot of different environments. Spruce are not, and so it's really about making sure that you've got that environment sort of set. If you don't have it, then think about not working with them too much. So, other than that, hopefully we'll be able to revisit the forest planting when we get to the repotting season, which will be next year. We'll try and find a suitable kind of slab and planting environment and things like that. But other than that, that's probably about it. I just do want to say thank you for bearing with us. It's been a terrible stream in terms of the technological side of it. My mobile phone is boiling hot because it's basically been streaming this whole thing. So apologies for the poor quality and any issues that we may have had. We've got coming up on Friday. All those people have donated up until this morning to the streams have had an email through from me about Q&A session on Friday. So if you haven't had that and you have donated, check your spam box. If it isn't there, then get in contact with me. Make sure you're on the mailing list. And so we'll be doing that on Friday, and then on Sunday we will be looking at Taxus, and that will be hopefully technologically we'll be back on track, and everything will be okay. The only other thing I want to say is, if you haven't already heard it, somebody did mention it in the chat, then there's a podcast on the Asymmetry podcast, which is by Mirai, Bonsai Mirai, Ryan Neal. His podcast is out. We did one a couple of weeks ago, and it's just been out released. So if you are really bored of an evening, then you can listen to me kind of like laughing a lot and being drunk. and talking about various different bonsai things. So that's good. But yeah, so apologies once again for the me being a little bit off key and a bit distracted. I did have loads of pictures and other stuff prepared, and not being able to show them has been really irritating. So so yeah, all I can say is I have already during the last video been on the beer because I've been so annoyed and stressed. And this evening has been brought to you by Spitfire, which is a relatively nice beer, even though it does come from down here and it's not from Yorkshire. So yeah, cheers. Hope everyone is stays safe and stays happy and works on your trees. All right, cheers.